Welcome to the first episode of Three Peas in a Pod, where today we're diving into public pedagogical perspectives in Bogotá. I'm Juliet.
I'm Seoin.
And I'm Daniel.
Let's get to it.
For this episode, we decided to focus on how our personal and academic backgrounds influence our perception of public spaces.
Although we explored many different parts of Bogotá, we chose to have a stronger emphasis on these three areas. La Candelaria, which is the historic, more touristy area of Bogotá. El Parque de los Periodistas, La Plaza de los Periodistas, which is close to the university and filled with young people. And Chapinero, which was around our hotel and is a financial, gastronomic, and overall wealthier area.
We decided to kind of divide it between our disciplines since we all come from different spaces and academic backgrounds. So we're going to explore these three areas through three different perspectives. And hopefully we can bring it back together at the end.
Okay. So I'll start with my my part of the podcast. So when I first arrived in Colombia, I felt disconnected. I was very aware of how I stood out as an Asian woman walking alone, and also of the glances and stares. So I wasn't even able to really appreciate public art surrounding me. I didn't quite know where I fit in, and I remember thinking right away about safety. Like, how can we make public art spaces feel physically safe? How do we make sure people feel welcome? But then, as I started learning more about Colombia's history and spending time in galleries and museums, something shifted. I actually began to feel connected. It was unexpected. To provide a little background information about me, I'm an international student from South Korea, a country with its own complex past, colonized by Japan, still technically at war with a lot of political problems. So when I learned more about Colombia's history of conflict and resilience, something clicked. There was this quiet shared understanding, even though our countries are so far apart. And two places really stuck with me: Fragmentos and the Centro de Memoria. So Fragmentos is the one on the left. Fragmentos especially moved me deeply. When I was doing the reading about Fragmentos, I'm not sure if you guys remember the reading by Susana Vargas.
Yeah.
I really like the idea of counter monument, focusing on the victims and the pain of the war, not the triumphs.
Mm.
And also, I was amused by the fact that unlike places like Auschwitz that you need to physically travel to, Fragmentos kind of brings memory to you, making it a lot more accessible. There's no sound, but it felt like I could almost hear the metal being struck, hear the stories being told, and it was just incredibly powerful. And what really struck with me during the talk was how memory itself changes over time, how it fades, softens, or shifts depending on who's remembering. And it made me think about how, in my country, the way people feel about North Korea has changed across generations. My parents, my generation, and now even my students. That emotional closeness to history isn't always passed down, but spaces like Fragmentos help keep that memory alive. They make it tangible for future generations, even as the past becomes more abstract. And it reminded me of my visit to the military museum in Bogota during my first few days. I was by myself and I ended up in this room dedicated to Colombian veterans who fought in the Korean War. It hit me emotionally, surrounded by these symbols of shared history. But at the same time, I also noticed other people passing through very quickly. For them, I guess maybe it didn't mean much. Later, when I was riding on Uber, the driver asked me where I was from and if I heard about the pagoda that was built to honor these soldiers. And he sounded very proud of it. And that contrasting reaction really stayed with me. It made me rethink about my earlier ideas about accessibility. I've been focused on the physical aspects, but now I'm thinking more about emotional and mental accessibility. In a city like Bogota, where public art is everywhere, maybe the question isn't, is art accessible, but is art meaningful? Like, who gets to feel something from it, and who even notices it, and who feels the sense of belonging in certain spaces? that really connects to something that came up in the talks we had in Colombia. The idea that it's a privilege to appreciate art, and I get that. So, how do we expand the circle of connection, and how do we make art feel meaningful to more people, not just those already tuned in the art world, right? So, one idea that came up to me is gamification. It was inspired by this Rome activity that the Sebastian Mira's game Pixel Quadrants, I think, that was called, that we did at Mammoth,
Mm-hmm.
a kind of a playful scavenger hunt through public spaces. And it reminded me of how, in my field, in physical education, we often use games to get people moving, participating, and having fun. So, what if we applied that to public art? What if we design routes that use public transportation and walking paths, turning the city itself into an interactive experience? This could go beyond just getting people to look at art. I think it could help them engage with it in new ways. Because if we're being honest, when we're surrounded by something all the time, we stop seeing it and it just fades into the background. But if we bring in like movement, surprise, playfulness, maybe we start to notice things differently and maybe we can feel things differently too. So after visiting Fragmentos and Centro de Memoria, I'm even more convinced that public art has this radical potential to shift power and to change narratives. A lot of history and art has been shaped by those in power, but public art can interrupt that. And I think educators can help bridge that gap. We can be the ones to say, this art is for you and this story does matter. So, yeah, that's where I am right now. And I'd love to hear any ideas or examples that make public art more emotionally accessible, more inclusive, and more alive from others.
I really
Yeah, that
like
was
that
really good.
idea of
Um,
gamification.
Thank you.
I found it really interesting what you said about Fragmentos because I feel the same way, but it's interesting because we're coming from completely different places. Like
Oh, yeah,
the
that's
fact
true.
that what you said about like you being able to feel the stories and like it bringing the memory to you, but it also allows
Mhm.
you to create your own emotional connection with it. And what I love about Fragmentos and what is talked about in the reading also is that it allows each person to have their own individual experience.
That's so
Yeah.
important on feeling welcome in
Mhm.
space is kind of being able to adapt it to your own because the art world can be kind of intimidating to someone who's not quite used to that and it can feel pretentious at times but when it becomes something that's like a reflection of self, I think that's really the key to getting people involved with public art and feeling attached to it in a way that's not intimidating.
Yeah.
True. And especially to even to people who are not familiar with Colombia's history, Fragmentos really like stood out. So it was really interesting.
Thank you, Solon, for that really insightful writing and discussion. I'll jump into my part. Before arriving into any new place, I like to take the time and go on Google Maps to explore Street View. I find this practice to put my chaotic mind at ease because there's so much truth in the daily world. Whether it be seeing the way that people are dressed, the types of stores that are in an area, or how the streets are set up, viewing a new place ahead of time is a sort of simulated reality that has always been deeply personal to me. As you can see on my map here, I had a lot of places saved before I came to Bogota, and I really felt like I knew the place ahead of time before being there. I relate this idea to the writing on Rome as well by Adeli Miles and Julie Libersat. They discuss placemaking as a communal effort, something that's shared by a community made up of small daily things. In that way, Google Maps is a sort of compiling of these little snippets of community. The Google reviews of certain restaurants or pictures added by patrons on business profiles. Before coming to Bogota, I did my research through looking at these things, and I felt like I had a bit of a place in the city that I'd never been to. Through our exploration of the three locations that we chose, I also wanted to include some mapping so that maybe someone could look at our presentation and feel a sense of place as well. A lot of my studies revolve around GIS, which is Geographical Information Sciences, and they're my main form of artistic expression. Although many of my geography classes are assessed on a strict rubric, this course has given me more open-mindedness when approaching map mapping. So I wanted to include some combination of maps and the art that we saw to blur the line between open-ended art and my cartography. Aside from map making in these three spaces, I wanted to explore the geographical concept of how there's perceived separation between humans and the environment, such as urban spaces, non-human entities, art, and nature. In Candelaria, people were leaning against murals, drawing in chalk on the street, and locking their bike against a sticker-covered stop sign. Just as we discussed in the Gallery Guardi presentation, there is an entrenchment of art and humans uninterrupted by perceived separation in this space. Around the university, there is music being performed in the plaza. Many groups of people were abuzz, setting up their blankets on a patch of grass or slacklining between two trees. Every step was taken was by someone sitting and enjoying the music. Here, the entrenchment was between the built environment and the humans. Or in some cultures, people might avoid sitting onto the grassy area because there was a small wall around it. Here, the wall was just another place to sit. The art also reflected this blur between public and individual. The area was filled with much more graffiti and less large-scale art than Candelaria. Even the art set up by organizations, such as the large Bogotá sign, was covered in graffiti, as if the people had fully taken ownership of the space. In Chapinero, the most distinct difference was experienced. After walking for about 5 minutes, our group was unable to find any bigger art than stickers on a signpost. After 10, we found some murals down a side street that were not readily visible for many walking routes. Chapinero is considerably more wealthy than the other two locations, which is apparently reason enough for clean walls devoid of expression. As we returned to the hotel, we sat for a minute and looked in our surroundings. A group of police officers were huddled around the signpost with stickers on it. My first thought was, oh, they're going to remove all the stickers, as if 10 officers were needed for the job. The fact that this perception came to mind exhibits how different the three spaces presented. The lack of art in this area somehow made it seem more criminal to have public art. Is public art more acceptable when it's en masse? It's easy to ignore one graffiti tag or a mural in an alleyway, but when art is wherever you turn, you can't avoid it readily. Through the exploration of these three areas, our group was able to gain a deeper understanding of how art influences the environment and vice versa. By understanding the physical position and existence of public art, one can get a glimpse into the history, culture, and daily interaction of an environment.
So
Thank you, Juliet. That was amazing.
I immediately what you said about the area around the university. It's super relevant to what I'm going to talk about. So, but I'll get to that later. But mainly, specifically, what you focus about, like the built environment being adapted to, or no, humans adapting the built environment to whatever they need. I found that, and I don't know if it's a cultural difference, but like people had to like there was like a big like propensity to do that. Like people were like really readily doing that, you know. It's not like people were uncomfortable with sitting on the like that wall, you know,
Yeah.
around the grass. Like you don't really think twice about it. Like you just kind of like hang like take over the space in whatever way you need it. You need it
Yeah.
to serve you, you know what I mean? Like
It's
and yeah.
expected. Yeah.
Yeah, I don't know.
It was honestly eye-opening. It makes me kind of reevaluate how I exist in Vancouver because I wish that I felt comfortable doing that, but I feel like I would get like weird looks and
Yeah.
someone would like take a video of me. I don't know. It's an odd difference.
Yeah, I really like the part when you said, if it's like if the art is rare, does it make it more valuable? And I also kind of like remember how we kind of had a talk about because art is just everywhere here, it's difficult to distinguish between public art and like the art that's like commissioned.
Mm-hmm.
In
So
Bogota?
yeah, in Bogota.
All right, and with that, we're going to move on to my portion of this, and I'll start by talking about my background. So, as someone who is of Colombian heritage and grew up with two Colombian parents, I feel like I had a relatively complicated relationship with my cultural identity growing up. But so much time without visiting and being unable to appreciate and understand the country and culture from a more mature perspective made me realize upon going there, like it made me have some big realizations about myself and my identity. And the main thing is that what I realized is as a 20-year-old that grew up in Vancouver, so a really young adult, I had been using individual experiences to construct my identity. But arriving and living in Colombia for like a month, first with the program and then with family, and meeting other people, this was a big thing, meeting other people my age from there made me realize that a large part of the identity that I had constructed that I thought was unique to me was actually part of this shared identity, this collective identity. And as time went on, this like this idea of like a collective identity, shared experiences, emotions, traditions became apparent to me not only in like social dynamics, like my personal experiences with other people, but also I began to think in terms of the urban environment and like how certain social norms, how people operate within space and like how that's affected by a country having like a shared history and a shared uh you know culture. So, well, when I started to observe the city of Bogota through like the individual versus collective lens, or like just trying to see those distinctions in the spaces, certain dynamics became really apparent. So, like, obviously, there's an issue of security, and there's a lot of crime and stuff in Colombia, and that creates really notable distinctions between public and private space. If you walk around neighborhoods, people make it really clear, like where you can and can't enter, where you are and you aren't welcome. There's a lot of barbed wire. There's a lot of electric fences. Um, Juliet and I saw this a lot, but people would like cement glass onto the top of buildings to make it like as a
Oh yeah, I
replacement for like
noticed
barbed
that too.
wire.
Mhm.
Um, so in a sense, there were some areas where this like sense of shared cultural identity and collectivity was like really strong, like La Candelaria or like especially like that university area that we were in front of the university. There's a lot of like Julia, like what you were talking about, where people kind of like I here in my notes I call it like they like appropriate the space. They like just come and take over and do whatever they want with it.
Yeah.
Um, for example, like La Pola, like like those steps that we sat on. I have a photo of us. I
Oh,
put the photo
yes.
of us in there. It's like these are steps, and like sure, maybe it was designed to have some seating and be kind of somewhat of a plaza area, but the way in which it's used now, I feel like has very much grown into its own thing, and
Mhm.
it's developed its own culture with people, going there to smoke cannabis,
Yeah.
like it being a place where that kind of stuff is like socially acceptable. I think is really interesting how that dynamic developed naturally. And contrasting this, there is when you go to higher, uh, the like just wealthier areas, higher income areas, the separations between what private and public spaces are become
Mhm.
more distinct. So like the security measures are stronger, the security measures are more clear, and things are more orderly, but they're also more separated. And that brings in my next point, which is like talking about informality.
Uh-huh.
And by informality, I just mean things that aren't organized by like bylaw, by government, things that aren't really enforced, things that kind of just develop in the urban space as a result of people trying to, figure things out. And in these informal spaces are typically more vibrant and diverse, is what I notice. They're spaces that are not created for a specific purpose to be used for a specific purpose, but are created and then appropriated by a group of people or a community that then lets that space grow into its own thing. And that, brings in ideas of like placemaking,
Mhm.
bringing meaning into spaces, public
Which is so
ownership.
rare in
Yeah,
Vancouver.
yeah. Yeah, it is very rare in Vancouver. There's also public ownership. For example, again, going back to La Pola here, it's like the art is almost like representative of people's ability to claim a space,
Mm.
Um, it's inviting for, certain groups, as in like hip university students, to go hang out there. And the art is done by the public, it's not like it's commissioned by the owners of those buildings. And that plays a role in establishing that area as somewhere that the public is meant to be. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah.
But going back to the issue of security, I wanted to kind of end off with a question, which was like, in a country that has a lot of issues with crime, how can we begin to lower these barriers and reduce the need for things like barbed wire, and reduce the presence of these like kind of security measures that just say like keep out, because it's complicated. You can't remove them without inviting crime. So that's kind of just what I wanted to leave things off with. Like, how can we begin to approach that?
I think that's a very big question.
Yeah, it's a very big question.
I think that's something good to leave that to the audience to
Yeah.
digest.
Yeah.
Thank you everyone for tuning in. We hope we've left you with some valuable insights and pertinent questions. Ciao.
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 Bye.